I don't want people to think that I'm some kind of expert on this, but I definitely think I know something about it. In 1960, although the Social Democratic Party had been quite dominant, I think, for some decades and then continued to be dominant, in 1960, I don't think the Swedish tax load was very high at all, and the extent of the government was very high at all. And then it accelerated aggressively and in a very bad way in the 60s, and then I'd say especially the 70s into the 80s. So, and Sweden prior to 1960, let's say for at least 60 years, like grew under free enterprise, I think you can fairly say, fairly free enterprise, a quite liberal era, very rapidly from a very poor country to a quite rich country. And so, and they come from a Lutheran, and it's a small group of singular language speakers, no one else except for some people in Finland speaks Swedish. So it's very much a Club Sweden, extended family kind of situation. And so what I'm saying is that Sweden very much has deep roots in, if you like, liberal civilization and classical liberal foundations, Northern Europe, Protestant, classical liberal foundations. So then they get their kind of leftism, very strong, aggressive, foolish leftism, which I don't really think the Social Democratic Party was that badly prior to 1960, into the 60s, 70s, 80s. And that's bad. And it doesn't go well by the end of the 80s and into the 80s. And then there's a very strong reaction. Sweden has a very interesting cultural, socio-cultural world where I do think there's kind of an operating central zone of influence and people who matter. That central zone expression is Edward Shills, a sociologist from Chicago, died maybe 20 years ago. And that central zone kind of, got up its back and pushed back. And there was real reform in the opposite direction in the 90s, especially after a financial crisis. And so Sweden has been, rethinking the aggressive 2 decades, you could say 2-3 decades it had with leftism, and just never became that bad. In terms of economic regulation, it's not as heavily regulated actually as the US. It does have a collective agreements labor market, which is very different and complicated, and you can't call free enterprise. But generally speaking, like something like occupational licensing is very light by American standards, just as an example. And just like governance and regulation in general, it's just not as insane and unworkable and unreasonable. It's kind of like the people imposing these rules and talking about them are like the third cousins, if you will, of the people who are suffering under them.
Right.
Up until recently, Sweden was Swedes, like about 8 million Swedes. Now there's about 10 million people in Sweden. So I'm just saying there's a lot of things to it. It's not socialist because it's always had big private and effective private industry. It did have nationalizations, but many of those were reversed in the 90s. A very open economy in terms of international trade. So it's a mixed bag. They do things like school vouchers. They don't do it that well, but they do have national school vouchers. Some privatization of the pension system. So it's an interesting place. It's not just a socialist, but it does have a big tax load.
Yeah.
It's not that progressive, the basic tax structure. I mean, people are expected to work.
If you like this video, check out the full interview. Also, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you get notified every time a new video is uploaded. Thanks for watching.